I grew up in church. I came from a Christian home and accepted Christ when I was 8 years old. I was watching Billy Graham on television. So it was kind of a natural progression for me because of the family I came from. And so I was in church my whole life, real involved in the youth group. I met the person that I married when I was 15 years old, and we got married when I was 16, which that's a whole nother story. But got married and continued going to church. We had 2 kids, and we always wanted to keep them involved in church. Unfortunately, after about 19 years, that marriage ended. And because I was a church girl and had spent most of my life trying to be a good Christian, it was a devastating time for me. So I'd spent so much of my life trying to make God happy and follow the rules and be a good Christian, and felt like He was not happy with me anyway. So I decided that I might as well do what I wanted and have some fun. So after my divorce, I started having what I considered at the time fun, and I was running around and I was partying, and unfortunately got myself into a place where I discovered I was pregnant. And I didn't feel like I could go to my church friends because I knew they would be judgmental. At least that's what I thought at the time. And so I decided that I had to do something different, and unfortunately the decision I made was to end the pregnancy. So I went quietly to a clinic and had an abortion, and nobody knew about it except the person who took me and one really good friend. After that, I was just trying to get on with my life, and so I tried to get back in church, and I prayed and asked God to forgive me, and I knew that He did. The problem is that over the years I continued to ask for forgiveness repeatedly. I remarried and we got involved in a church in Goshen, and we loved it. It's been a great church. We still go there. But as time went on, I heard the Holy Spirit speaking to me about, at some point I want you to share your story. And I thought, well, that'll be good. Someday I'll do that. But I was able to push that thought, out into the future. It had been about 13 years, and I worked really hard to keep that part of my life a secret, because there's so much shame attached to it, and it's just not something you talk about in church. But I knew that it was God, and so I started to pray and ask Him who He wanted me to tell, because I couldn't imagine who I would tell. And about that time, our pastor's wife walked in, and I thought, okay, of all people. But I knew that she was the person that God wanted me to talk to. So I called her, and we had coffee, and I opened up my story to her. And that really was the open door that God used to begin a work in my life. Shortly after that, I went to a ladies' retreat at our church, and there was a woman there that told a story about her daughter who had gone through an unplanned pregnancy. Fortunately, kept her child, but they were connected with Retta. So when I told her my story, she said, "You need to contact Retta." And by this point in my life, I had decided that I wanted to be able to help other women that were struggling. So I got a hold of Roxana at Retta and told her kind of briefly in an email my story, and that I was wanting to, help other women that were suffering. And she was very excited, emailed me back right away and told me that they were just beginning an abortion recovery ministry. She asked me if I had been through a Bible study for post-abortive women, and I said that I hadn't. But I thought it would be great training, to help me help other women. I got invited to a weekend retreat and Bible study called Forgiven and Set Free. And my whole intent for that weekend was to get trained so that I would be able to help other women that were going through the same things I'd gone through. I had no idea that God had other plans for the weekend. So what God did for me on that weekend has absolutely revolutionized my walk with Christ. It taught me more about His love and grace than anything I've ever been through. And it was that moment where God took me by the hand and walked me back 13 years to the day I walked into a clinic and made a decision that changed my life forever. And it was one of the hardest moments of my life. I was broken, and I hadn't really looked at it for the last 13 years. It was the first time I really had to face the decision I'd made. As I was laying there, reliving that moment and watching myself climb up on that table, the rain started to fall on the tarp over the table I was laying on, and I just knew that God was crying with me. Not just because he was disappointed, or not because I had taken the life of my child, but because he loved me and he knew that I was hurting and he was crying with me. God gave me a vision that I'll never forget, and it was, I could see myself as a young girl in a large ballroom, and there was a massive crowd, and I was standing in the middle of the crowd, and I looked up toward the front of the room, and I could see the king seated up on his throne. And I remember standing there and watching him as he stood from the throne and stepped down to the floor we were all standing on, and I realized he was making his way through the crowd, and he came and stopped right in front of me, and he took my hand and we danced. And it was the moment I knew I was free. It was the first time that I understood God's grace and his love. And it has never been the same since. And I live a life now that I couldn't have imagined. And, I went into the weekend thinking that this was all about others and me helping other women. But God knew that it was all about getting me free. And so that has just changed my life in ways that I can't describe.